Hello and welcome to the latest Fun Skills 2019 monthly update. I was going to say good afternoon. This is actually a re-recording of the session that took place on the 5th of June last week. I was just trying to suddenly remember the day. It's hard to believe that we've actually reached the 10th webinar in this series, and it might be opportune to remind you that the complete box set of recordings and slides from all previous 9 sessions are available from our functional skills updates page. So what's coming up today? Well, it's actually just me today for starters. It is quite a busy time for us at the moment. We're lots and lots of launch events going on at the moment. Amanda last week was taking a well-deserved break, and Catherine was actually, as I was delivering the live session last week, finishing off a launch event in the next room. Purpose of this session was really to have a slightly more detailed look at maths, particularly the subject content statements and how they follow through into assessment outcomes. I was going to say post your questions, but we're not live at the moment, so you can't really. But I will say that we do always look at those questions, even if we can't necessarily answer them kind of there and then. So if you're new to these sessions, and apologies if this sounds like a broken record, but if this is your first Fun Skills webinar, please be aware that you can find much more information about the 2019 reforms on our dedicated updates page. The link on this slide will take you straight there, and do remember that we always send these slides out a day or so after each webinar, so you can watch the recording back at your leisure. If you haven't already done so, please sign up for our email updates. You really don't want to miss out on any important time-critical information, especially at the moment now we're moving into this real final critical phase before the launch of the new qualifications. The arrow that you can see on this slide here is pointing you to the link that appears at the bottom of every Sitting Girls web page, and that directs you to where you can sign up. So, latest news. Well, the big news, and we'll cue a quick drum roll here, is that we can now reveal that our level 1 and level 2 reform functional skills qualifications have now successfully completed the Ofqual technical evaluation process. Sounds like a huge milestone, and it is, and I think we've alluded before that that process has been extremely thorough, has involved a great deal of liaison between our assessment development team and their colleagues at Ofqual. I think we've also mentioned this before, but not only has it involved the Ofqual's evaluators looking at our handbook documents and our assessments with a real fine-tooth comb, they've also been looking really closely at our operational processes. So it's especially significant that we've got level 1 and level 2 with the external assessment components to those officially over the line. As I said, we're still working closely with Ofqual to complete the process for entry level. And again, I think we've mentioned this in previous sessions, we quite deliberately held off from submitting our entry level assessments into that formal process until we were quite close to getting level 1, level 2 through. So with the operational stuff now pretty much dealt with, it shouldn't be long until those are signed off too. I think, as I said before, we're flat out with launch events at the moment. Three events last week, more happening this week as well. We're continuing to squeeze in more dates and venues as we agree them, so do keep checking the booking page. And if you've already been to any of the events, thank you again. I hope you did find it useful. Okay, just a quick word now, just to change the subject slightly, is to talk about ICT and the plan to develop a new suite of digital functional skills qualifications over the next couple of years. There are 2 consultations running at the moment, one from the DFE looking at the proposed subject content for this suite of qualifications. It follows on from a consultation they did a couple of months ago about the more flexible essential digital skills qualifications. Please don't get confused between the 2, they are quite different. But there will be another consultation from Ofqual looking specifically at the regulatory arrangements for digital functional skills. We'll send out links to both consultations in the follow-up email from this webinar. So please do engage with these if you've been interested in what happens to ICT, or actually even if you don't. I mean, if there's one thing to kind of perhaps bear in mind from the Fun Skills Reform Programme, one of the things that can often mean that we end up with things we don't necessarily want is if we don't respond to government and regulator consultations in large enough numbers. The other thing to say just before we move on is that the sample assessments for our reformed functional skills qualifications are still, for the time being, on our 3748 page. Again, see the link from this slide. We're currently building a new web page for 4748, so they will be moved at some point over the next few weeks. We'll also be adding the handbook and spec documents, although anyone who's been to the events will have already seen those, and it is worth reiterating that the actual content of the new qualifications is set out in the DFE subject content document. So don't feel that you can't start planning things like schemes of work and getting ready for September without the copies of the final documents. The specs, i.e. the content of what the new qualifications will involve, is still very much known already. Again, just to move on again, we, as I said, have events. We do have events that are filled. A lot of the events that we have put on are already full, although there are waiting lists for those. But these are some of the dates that we know where there are still places available. Worth bearing in mind that we have included a list of the dates that still have spaces on the front of the 3748 qualifications webpage under the admin tab rather than the documents tab. We're updating that every day or so, so it should be reasonably accurate. But obviously the actual booking page on Eventbrite, the link you can see at the bottom of this, at the top of this slide will take you there, has got the actual booking details. Probably opportune for me to kind of make a gentle plea at this point, however. If you can't, for whatever reason, attend an event you've booked onto, please do let us know so we can release your place to somebody else on the waiting list. It's not difficult to do that. You just need to log into Eventbrite and cancel your booking. Another thing to say, and again, please don't take this the wrong way, is that we've designed these events on the understanding that each centre would normally send no more than a couple of delegates who would then cascade information back to their colleagues. We've held back from enforcing that rule so far, although if you do have a number of people from your organisation booked to attend, please do think carefully about whether they all really do need to attend or whether that place could alternatively go to one of the centres that hasn't been able to secure a place. It is worth also mentioning, just whilst we're kind of on the subject of events, is that we're planning some separate webinars for quality and exams teams specifically to help them prepare. That will be separate from this regular monthly update series, but we will be putting those on over the summer, so again do look out for those. So just to reiterate on the transition, and again before we start sort of looking closely at maths again, here's a sort of timely reminder of the transition from legacy functional skills to the new ones. I think, as we've always said, the first and the last dates on this table are absolutely set in stone. The new functional skills qualifications are underpinned by new regulatory conditions. So awarding organisations really will have to stop accepting registrations for the legacy qualifications on the 31st of August this year and stop issuing certificates for those on the 31st of August 2020. So we won't be able to do what we normally do, which is kind of have late registrations and late certifications be able to be dealt with for either 3748 or 374802. And that's really where these other milestone dates come from, and it's about us working with you to ensure that any candidates who are registered after September and are working towards the legacy qualifications have enough time built in to complete their assessments and go through all of the normal quality processes and obviously where necessary have results claimed. The first one to be aware of, the 35th of April date, is when we're planning to take down the internal assessment documents for our website, and when we would expect those to have all taken place by. We also won't be facilitating any further external assessments after the end of May next year, and we're also expecting any EQA activity that relates specifically to the legacy qualifications to have happened by the end of July next year. That's really significant for any centres that don't have direct claim status at that point in the journey. Another point, just quickly, we will be releasing fast track approval forms for the 4748, the new qualification suite, shortly. I know lots of people are asking about those. The forms are going to require a little bit more information than usual, just to confirm your understanding of the reformed qualifications and some of the expectations that go with those. One of the things we're looking at the moment is whether it would be possible to roll over direct claim status where you currently have that for the legacy 3748 qualifications. No decision's been taken on that point as yet, but we will confirm this, of course, when we issue the forms. So diving into maths, before we start, it is worth mentioning that we are currently working on a version 2 of the maths mapping document, not taking anything away from what's already there, but adding a little bit more commentary and some other information on top of what's already there. We're hoping to have that ready later this month, and after that we'll do a similar job on the English document. And it's worth saying at this point that next month's webinar is going to be doing a similar dive into English. We will nevertheless, during this session, talk you through some of what we're planning to include in the revised mapping document. Also, when we did the live session last week, we asked you for your thoughts on some of the things that you would find especially useful to include. So if you did respond to that survey, quick moment to say thank you for that. And again, just one final point before we move on. The focus for this session will be specifically on level 1 and level 2, but I no doubt we will be returning to entry level in another webinar very soon. So just to move on, sorry, going too far. Many of you will remember this document, the Adult Numeracy Core Curriculum. Much as we've talked about the level expectations for the reformed functional skills diverging in some respects from the adult numeracy standards, don't bin your curriculum document just yet. It is still an extremely valuable resource. It is nearly 20 years old. It still talks about teletext, and I still have an extremely dog-eared copy of both this curriculum and the literacy document at home. And it's also worth saying our functional skills examiners still regularly reach for it if they're making any tricky judgments about whether to give an award or give a mark or not. There are links to both the numeracy and the literacy curriculum documents from our functional skills webpage. That's if you're struggling to find a copy on the Excellence Gateway. Reason really for mentioning it now is that one of the things we're thinking, or we're planning, more than thinking, we're planning to include in the updated mapping grids is the relevant core curriculum references. So moving on to level 1, level 2, sorry, I'm going backwards and forwards now. Just to summarise how maths at level 1 and level 2 operates, I think we have covered this. Certainly if you've been to the event, you'll be very familiar with this, but just to reiterate, we are generally talking about the level 1, level 2 externally marked assessments and describing them as exams rather than assessments. It does reflect the changed invigilation requirements and the renewed rigour that underpins the reformed qualifications. We are, certainly as it indicates on this slide, we were looking at having an overall time allowance for both the calculator and the non-calculator sections, although it is worth saying that we haven't made a final decision on that. There is a slight issue that might kind of prompt a rethink here, in that we are making an upgrade to the Evolve system during this autumn. One of the things we want to be sure about is that the overall time allowance that we planned works correctly on that system. We might, if we do find there's any issues with that, then we might need to rethink that notion of the overall time allowance rather than a fixed allowance for each session. But obviously we'll keep you posted if there is a specific change to that. And to touch on the assessment spec, again, if you've been to the events, you'll be familiar with this, but if you haven't, probably worth understanding that maths at level 1 and level 2 is a single exam, but with 2 distinct sections. The non-calculator section and then the calculator permitted section. It is perhaps important to think of it as a calculator permitted section, because there will be a number of questions within even that section that don't necessarily need a calculator. We have within the regulations for the new functional skills a requirement to assess at least 75% of the content based on problem solving, and roughly a quarter based on underpinning knowledge for underpinning skills. We do need to assess an elements of both across both the non-calculator and the calculator section. So you can see from this grid that there are within the non-calculator section of the exam. 15 questions, 10 of those will be testing underpinning skills, 5 of those will be testing the problem solving capability. So it is roughly sort of a kind of a slight balance there. And similarly on the calculator permitted section, 45 marks in total. 40 of those marks are orientated towards problem solving, and 5 of those marks are orientated towards underpinning skills. So there is an element of both across both papers. If you've noticed from the sample paper, if you've looked at sample papers, certainly one of the things you will see is that the 3 huge mammoth tasks that we have in the legacy qualifications have gone. What you will see instead are a series of self-contained questions. So you have that kind of that notion as well. So just to illustrate that there is some new content. One of the changes I know has worried people has been this sort of notion that there's lots and lots of new content that hasn't previously been in either the functional skills criteria or the adult numeracy standards. And particularly, I know also the notion that some of the technical demand has shifted between levels. These 4 bullets here, 4 bullet points here are 4 things that really are wholly new content at level 1, or certainly things that haven't been assessed or haven't been figured in level 1 previously. The subject content statements, SCS, you'll get used to that acronym, come directly from the DFE subject content document that underpins functional skills maths. So when I was talking a second ago about our final versions of our spec documents, the content, in other words, the standards, this DFE document is your go-to for those, and that document was published in March 2018. So do bear in mind those statements are basically what all awarding organisations' functional skills qualifications are required to address. Just to illustrate and give some examples of how some of this new content might be assessed in practice, we've got 2 examples on this slide. These have been taken from the first sample paper that we produced for level 1, so you may recognise these questions, but please don't assume these are the last word in how we would ever assess these. It will vary. The first example here might be described as quite a good example of a problem-solving task. So it's a question that has a context. It's about buying a coat, but it involves obviously having to work out a 30% discount. So the calculating discounts in multiples of 5% obviously is the subject content statement that we're seeking to assess through that question. Similarly, the second question is what we might describe as an underpinning skills question. There's no context to this other than you're making a cube, and it is just simply about obviously recognising the correct net form for that. Okay, these are some examples. The next 3 slides are going to look at some content that isn't wholly new, but is either assessed more explicitly or in greater detail. So if we take that first example, and you can see, those of you who are familiar with the core curriculum will see the core curriculum references that we've added to these just to reference them. Sometimes the terminology was slightly different, but the skill itself or the competency itself was largely the same. So if we take the first example on this slide, recognise and use positive and negative numbers. The wording was slightly different in the core curriculum, recognising negative numbers in a practical context. Similarly, use multiplication facts and make connections with division facts, N1, L1.5. The core curriculum wording was recalling multiply facts up to 10 by 10. We've got calculate the squares of 1-digit, 2-digit numbers. Slightly different wording, but again appeared in the curriculum, and the same with the add, subtract, multiply, and divide decimals up to 2 decimal places, which were previously decimals were used to within add and subtract calculations up to 2 decimal places, but multiply and divide will now be assessed as in the core curriculum as well. And similarly, rounding, although it wasn't explicitly covered in the core curriculum. It wasn't necessarily in the legacy functional skills subject content. So rounding, I guess we assessed it indirectly previously. It is now going to be an explicit part of the functional skills maths assessment. Some more examples here, and again, same principle applies. Probably worth saying that the interest one, it isn't the calculate simple interest in multiples of 5% wasn't directly referenced in the curriculum, but it was given as a suggested activity under the N1L2 area. So it is area that's featured, sorry, that's a typo on that slide, it's N1L1. So it was actually featured at level 1, even though it wasn't necessarily kind of there in the standards as something that learners specifically were expected to know. It was given as a suggestion as to how they might work with percentages. And again, just some more examples of level 1 content assessed more explicitly or in greater detail. Again, they use equally likely outcomes to find the probabilities of similar events and express them as fractions. Was slightly different terminology, show that some events are more likely to occur than others, and again some of the others. The cuboids was given as an example rather than explicit in the core curriculum under the measure shape and space level 1 .10. Again, just to give some suggestions as to questions, and again these come from the level 1 sample that we published a couple of months ago, and again these are perhaps again quite good examples of a mixture of kind of context type questions and context free questions. The question 1 is about as context free as you can get, whereas that question 14 obviously is a much more involved question, and is obviously looking at that data handling and grouping discrete data and representing it graphically. So moving on to level 2, a little bit more new stuff, and obviously it's not stuff that's moved down a level. It is new, but again these are ones sort of subject content statements that don't have an obvious sort of read across in terms of the existing numeracy core curriculum. Certainly aspects of these that will have figured in GCSE, so they're not new completely within the level 2 space, and some obviously may have appeared in a roundabout way in the legacy assessments, but obviously it's the first time that they've been explicitly expected. It is worth saying actually one of the examples here is understanding the order of operations including indices, which again was never explicitly mentioned in the core curriculum. It tended to sort of approach more from the angle of efficient methods of calculation, but I think in practice it was taught about using calculators correctly. We are actually required to actually assess order of operations, but generally we will seek to do that in the non-calculator paper rather than necessarily the calculator paper. That won't always be the case, but generally that will be so. Again, to sort of give some examples of how this new content might be assessed, and again these just happen to be the examples from the first sample paper that we produced rather than anything else, but illustrates these as well. You just have obviously these examples here. And again, a couple more. Again, obviously they're illustrating the angles and the coordinates. Clearly you can see from this question and some examples of how they might be assessed. And some more examples. And again, this is sort of an example of perhaps estimating the mean from of a group frequency distribution from discrete data. So you've got obviously one having to work out the 0 to 9, the 10 to 19, and obviously working out values on the back of those as well, and understanding that is discrete data. Okay, moving on to level 2. These are some things that you might kind of categorize as greater clarity and more detail rather than wholly new content. For example, subject content statement 5 was previously described in the core curriculum as find the percentage parts of quantities and measurements and evaluate on number as a percentage of another. So again, different wording, but not wholly new as a concept. Similarly, subject content statement 7, the level 2, I think ordering fractions has always been there, but here we also have adding and subtracting fractions into the mix, and whilst mixed numbers have always appeared in the core curriculum at level 1, improper fractions have now been added to the descriptors. Subject content 8 was slightly different terminology used, but it was evaluate on number as a fraction of another rather than the new wording express one number as a fraction of another. And subject content statement 9, I'll get the words out in the end. The only change here is that originally this said order, approximate and compare decimals when solving practical problems. We've got rid of the when solving practical problems here in the obviously with the new focus on the underpinning skills. They may not always be asked in a context. Some more greater clarity and more depth questions. Again, these 3 examples again were each featured in the core curriculum, but generally obviously tended to be assessed as part of a scenario or a context rather than being tested directly when it came to the legacy functional skills qualifications. Take the example of subject content statement 13, the calculate amounts of money, compound interest, etc. They were usually kind of addressed through kind of questions if they had kind of tax or budgeting. Obviously, so the subject content itself is not new, but that perhaps reiterates the need to focus on kind of real world context and particularly the world of work at level 2 as a kind of driver for functional skills. And similarly with the subject content statement 17, using formulae to find the volumes and surface areas of 3D shapes was in the curriculum. It tended to be regular 2D and 3D shapes. What we would have done in the past is given the learner a formulae for a cylinder, but this illustrates here obviously that they would be expected to know that. So obviously a little bit of understanding pi would be called for there. So that's a kind of tour of maths. Just to sort of roll on a little bit further and perhaps reiterate that the Open Assess platform that we launched at the beginning of May is now available, is being used. We are still planning to develop some walkthrough videos to kind of help illustrate how to use this, although it is relatively intuitive. The thing that we are aware of is that there are still a few centres that have yet to get hold of the or we've yet to be able to get in touch correctly with their evolved technical contact, and we're obviously working through kind of sorting out logins. If you haven't managed to get that sorted, do just give our customer services team a quick call, because they should then be able to sort of point you in the right direction and get you operating with that. Worth reiterating that the Open Assess system at the moment only hosts the legacy qualifications on screen tests, whilst we're still doing final work to kind of make the new qualifications assessments look as nice as they can. We'll hold off on putting them onto the Open Assess platform, although they'll certainly go up there from September when the qualifications themselves go live. And just to say, on sample assessments generally, we have a complete set of sample assessments, or a complete one of everything, if you like, set for the new maths and English at both level 1 and level 2. The level 1, level 2 documents, despite Ofqual obviously okaying our plans, the documents are still labelled draft because there are still some cosmetic changes that we're planning to make. But in terms of the understanding the content of them, they are as good a guide as they're going to be. And similarly, a lot of our hand documents, we may still make some sort of non-critical changes to the content, but nevertheless, obviously, whilst we're doing that, they will still kind of carry a draft watermark. Also worth saying, because I know that a couple of people have been, certainly I've had a couple of conversations with people who've been tripped up by that. At the moment, the way that we've published the sample assessments is that we have the question paper and the mark scheme all in one document rather than separate documents for each. But it does mean if you're printing it off, you've got kind of everything in one go. So just to finish off, I won't do the mapping document questions because I think you've we did those last week, and similarly won't do any questions because we've had that last week, and obviously that's been and gone. So just to finish off, we are planning next month to do a similar walkthrough of the English assessments and understanding kind of particularly where there have been level changes and adjustments to those. We're doing these webinars obviously every month right through to the summer, and we'll also be continuing to do a monthly webinar series after the summer. So if you signed up to get those, you will get the reminders every month. And as I said at the beginning, obviously there are recordings of every session to date. The one exception of the font is the special phonics webinar that we did, and those are available to obviously box set binge on whenever you're free to or have a moment to do that. If there's anything in particular you'd like us to kind of cover in a future session, do drop us a quick line to the our functional skills reform inbox, the fsreform@sittingguilds.com, and obviously if those things come to us, we'll obviously look at that regularly, and if we can do that, we certainly will. And just finally, it just remains to say thank you once again. As again, that email address fsreform@sittingguilds.com is there if you need to drop us a line. Likewise, follow myself, Amanda or Catherine on social media if you have a chance. If you come into the events, obviously we'll look forward to seeing you, whichever one of us happens to be there. But otherwise, enjoy the next month, and we'll join you again in July. Thanks again.